The CONCACAF Women's Gold Cup. Let's talk about it. We are finally back after what seemed like a 2-week hiatus, not by choice, but by force of having to sit down and write midterms. However, I have obviously been watching the CONCACAF Women's Gold Cup and have a lot of thoughts about what the hell has been going on. So this year and right now in March is currently hosting the inaugural CONCACAF Women's Gold Cup, which includes CONCACAF nations as well as 4 guest CONMEBOL nations. It is the first friendly of its type where there was qualifications, there was group stages, and then obviously the quarters, semis, and the final, which has now been set between the US and Brazil. Which means Brazil, a CONMEBOL nation, can win the CONCACAF Cup even though they're not a CONCACAF nation, and I'm actually very much sad for that. I'm also Canadian, so of course I'll be rooting for Brazil, but there was a lot of hopes and I guess expectations of CONCACAF finally rolling this women's competition. You know, you've got different nations. This was right after the World Cup in terms of, you have Colombia, who did incredibly well at the World Cup and have some very, very talented players. Mexico missed at the World Cup, but we all know how much talent they have in their squad, and with the rise of Liga MX in Mexico, we're finally going to see that impact on the national team. The US and Canada both crashing per their standards at the World Cup, finally have a chance to bounce back going into the Olympics. Brazil in the same boat. They went into the World Cup as Copa America champions, and look what happened in the World Cup. So this CONCACAF was supposed to be really fun, and I think what we've seen is it has been a lot of missed opportunities and a lot of chances that have been completely mishandled about pushing this competition, but most importantly, the soccer in the region. I'm going to start off with the US versus Canada in the semifinals. I think that was an embodiment of this CONCACAF Gold Cup, but it was also an embodiment of how CONCACAF feels about women's football or women's soccer in the region. There's probably over a dozen examples that I can bring up and say, well, CONCACAF could have done better here, CONCACAF should have done this, X, Y, and Z, but this game, Canada and the US, you're talking about arguably the biggest powerhouses in the competition, the biggest 2 teams in CONCACAF, and the ball was completely dropped for that game. And for those who are unaware, the US and Canada semifinal game was played on a waterlogged pitch. Essentially, it was puddles, it was lakes, players were slipping. I mean, you couldn't really see who had the ball because it was just water all over the place. Players were slipping left and right, and it was just an abysmal showcase of safeguarding. San Diego, which is where the game took place, doesn't typically get this much amount of rainwater, which is understandable and something that the organizers in terms of San Diego Wave, whoever was hosting, can really work around. But CONCACAF, what the hell were they thinking letting that game go on? The second the players took to the pitch and kickoff went on in that first pass, or honestly, I wouldn't really categorize it as a pass, first contact between the ball and a foot of a player, the ball didn't essentially roll. There was alarm bells. They allowed it to go on for a few minutes, and the referee took the ball to the side, was communicating with the 4th official, just the officials on the VAR, X, Y, and Z, and then she rolled the ball, and obviously the ball didn't really roll because they were essentially playing on a lake, but the game went on. You can hear Lindsay Horan on the broadcast tell the referee, we can't play in this. Players were obviously very frustrated. Even Jessie Fleming, who's a player that never gets worked up, communicated a few times to the referee, like, what the hell is this? What are we doing? And I think each minute that went on, I was just shocked that the game was actually going on. The first US goal came in, which I'm shocked that it even stood, but I'm just shocked that even the game was played, regardless. The players were tripping on the ball was not moving, it was long pass after long pass, because essentially the players were just trying to get the ball off the pitch, like just put it in the air and hope somebody gets a head on it. We had 151 throw-ins that game because it was just that frustrating where the ball would just always go out because it was long pass after long pass. And that first 45 minutes, I honestly, when we got to halftime, I could not believe the game was being played. The game goes on not only 90 minutes, 120 minutes, we go to penalties. Canada have a shocking display of a penalty shootout and lose. Canada are knocked out. The US go on. So what did we learn from 2 of the biggest nations in the world, 2 nations that are ranked in the top 10 FIFA rankings. What did we learn from that incredible matchup? Nothing. There are practically 0 soccer takeaways from that game. I don't even know if you'd even consider the penalty shootout a takeaway, because the players had just gone into a slip and slide for the past 120 minutes, that even though Canada had the most shocking display of penalties and Alyssa Nair took all her rage out from the World Cup, I'm not even really sure what we take away from that. There's nothing that we have learned about soccer in that game, but we did learn a lot about CONCACAF and how they view women's football in this region. We also took some lessons about the safeguarding and the priorities that CONCACAF have when hosting events like this. So we learned a lot about CONCACAF, but we learned absolutely nothing about the game, which is such a wasted opportunity, because you're talking about the US and Canada, like I mentioned, a huge rivalry, one of the biggest on the international stage. Both teams are in a transitional period. Both have bounced back relatively well from the World Cup. They're preparing to go to the Olympics. This was going to be a very valuable matchup for both teams. Both teams did not learn anything. Hell, even in the press conferences, both the US and the Canadian head coach were talking about the fact that the game plan went out of the window from minute 1. The players were also not happy. Caitlin Sheridan afterwards said that we just had to do what we were told to do, which is take on the pitch and deal with the conditions. And it sucks. It sucks that the coaches didn't learn anything. It sucks that these camps trained extremely hard to go against each other and learn nothing. I mean, why should we have to constantly and consistently deal with watching and seeing women's football players just dig it out and do it? They couldn't do anything. I mean, they couldn't just walk off the pitch. I would have loved to see that. I think they should have definitely took some stand where the referee communicated with somebody else again about the situation. But the players just had to go on and do what they were doing. And, I don't think any of them enjoyed it. I think you watch some of these post-match interviews when they were in the tunnels, the players looked just so happy to be wearing dry clothes. They were wet head to toe, hair to socks. Socks wet for 120 minutes. That sounds like an absolute nightmare, let alone having to run in them, having to play an entire soccer game. Like, I don't think any of the players enjoyed it, but it just once again reiterates the point of women's footballers just have to deal with it. This is what they've been conditioned to do. This is what they're expected to do. And this is what they've had to do in the youth stages leading up to the senior stages. This is probably all they've known, is that they've had to deal with it. Waterlogged, if it's snowy, if it's sliding, whatever the situation is, you are expected to take on the field and do what you're supposed to do, which is play the game. And I think that is a very stanky attitude that we kind of need to drop in the sport. Understandably, it's probably not us that are enforcing this expectation, but it is so frustrating to see this happen over and over again. And I mean, women's football is the biggest it's ever been. And if this is still something that we are expected to tolerate, I have some pretty bad news for people who are organizing these events, because this is not tolerable. The conditions that the players had to play in are conditions that not a single team should be playing in. No men's, no women's, no 5th tier, no 10th tier, no 1st tier. This is just not safe, regardless who the hell's taking on the pitch. But you're talking about multiple World Cup champions. You're talking about the current reigning Olympic champions, big teams, big names, big rivalry, and CONCACAF did not give them the canvas to properly showcase their soccer. Those teams and those players and those stars, a lot of them young stars that I know are going to be in these teams for the next decade or so, were not allowed to present and show their individual and collective brilliance. And that really bothers me, because as federations and as confederations and as people who run events, they have a responsibility to make sure that the players have or the players are in a perfect condition to showcase their standard of soccer. And that was not there. They failed them. And in a time where it's so important that we continue to grow the exposure of the game, I don't know how many new fans were in the stadium, and I don't know how many new fans tuned in, but if I was a new fan and I was tuning in for the first time, I probably would not be tuning into another women's football game. I don't think I would, because I'm like, if they're not taking it seriously, why would I give it another shot? If this is the level of football that I'm expected to enjoy, what the hell is this kind of football? Because it wasn't. And we didn't get to see these two go at it. If I was somebody who was not covering the game and I was not actually reporting on the game, I think I would have probably tuned it off 30 minutes in, because I was like, I don't need to be up here till 2 a.m. watching players have to deal with this horrible condition because they've been thrown into it. I really don't think I would have stayed up till 12 a.m. having to watch this. So everybody was basically robbed from a competitive game of soccer. And after the game wrapped up, I was able to talk to a few people who were in the stadium and a few CONCACAF folks even that were in the stadium present. And something that I heard very frequently is that nobody in the stadium really knew who had the final decision and the final say, which to me raises a lot of safeguarding questions, because these are procedures that should have been covered way before the first group match stage even started. I meant group stage match even started. These safeguarding concerns, questions, conditions, standards should be laid months in advance, and who has the final call and who has the final say should already be laid out. And the fact that it sounds like nobody really knew who was taking that final yes, stop it, or no, keep it going, is a concern. That was not a safe pitch whatsoever. I'm shocked, and I'm very presently happy to hear and see that no player came out with a very terrible injury. Obviously, Vanessa Giles took a very, very bad punch to the head and was taken off for concussion protocols. Beth Priestman in the press conferences later said that, she wasn't showing any concussion symptoms, but I'm shocked to see that not a single player, I'm surprised to see every single knee that stepped on the pitch came off intact. Player safety not only was, not on their priority list, it just wasn't there. They didn't look at player safety. Even if player safety was number 10th on the list, I think the game would have been stopped by like the 10th minute. Player safety was not considered at all. I do not know how you look at that game and be like, yeah, we should keep going. It'll get better in about 20 minutes. This is pretty safe for the players. We're protecting them and we're fulfilling our duty. No chance. And as officials and referees, they have a duty to protect the players. Two very important things. Protect the players and make sure the ball is rolling. The ball was not rolling and the players were not protected. And that, I'm kind of laughing a little bit now, but that is really just, and it puts the integrity of this Gold Cup into question. And for a lack of better words, it's almost like, how unserious are they? Because I think if safeguarding guidelines and standards were set, player safety would have been at the top of the list and the game would have not gone on. And what pains me is that we're in a time in women's football where we have seen a lot of ACL injuries. We are seeing major injuries, not just ACLs, but just big traumatic injuries to knees and other parts of the body. And a lot of these injuries are occurring on regular turf, on perfectly fine pitches where it's not filled out with water and lakes all around. So we're already seeing this alarming number of injuries on a regular pitch. How do you think that number increases, or the likelihood of a player getting injured on a pitch like that? And so I think CONCACAF really dropped the ball here. I don't think any of the players were enjoying the game. Like I mentioned, they looked the happiest they were that entire time in the post-match interviews, because they were very happy to be in dry clothes. And I think as a Canadian too, this really, really bothers me, because we need good competition. We need tough opposition going into the Olympics. And I think the US was our first real big test, and we were coming off a kind of gritty, frustrating, annoying win over Costa Rica, where this was going to be a bounce back and this was going to be a reaction. Actually, like I mentioned, there was not a lot of soccer stuff to take away from this, but a few things that I was able to learn from this Canadian team is that they actually showed character. They were actually up for the challenge against the Americans, and they did not back down. When momentum was swinging against them, or just, the ball wasn't rolling, they didn't shy down, which I don't think is something I would have been able to say about this Canadian side 3 years ago. So I think I was impressed to see an aspect of, yes, we're actually happy to bring this challenge to the Americans. Understandably, the odds and the stats and the numbers really do not favor Canada against the US. Historically haven't. Historically, it's a pretty consistent loss against the US. Last time we faced them in a semifinal was the Olympics, and we know how that went. So I'm sure there's a bit of a mentality thing where Beth Priestman is able to get the team ready against the US in a big occasion game like that. But again, we were robbed of that. Okay, we learned a few things about their character, but how does that look on a perfectly okay pitch? It's the same thing for the US. They bounced back against Colombia from their loss to Mexico. But how were they able to keep that statement going? On top of that, the attendance and the marketing and the visibility of the Gold Cup has been very, very poor. I've spoken to many individuals that are related within the event planning, and they are also like, you know what, we're in San Diego and we're actually not seeing any advertisement about it. Mind you, the final is happening in San Diego. Even fans online and in social media have been very vocal about that they are followers, they're keen, close followers of the sport, and did not know the CONCACAF was happening until the CONCACAF kicked off, or until some players were missing from their European clubs and they're like, oh, where the hell is, I don't know, Emily Fox, for example, for Arsenal? Where's Chloe Lacasse? Oh, they're actually in the Gold Cup. What the hell is that? The weather for some of these games has not been the friendliest. I completely acknowledge that. You know, Costa Rica versus El Salvador maybe is not going to pull the biggest numbers, but you're touring in areas that have huge populations of the teams and the nations that are there. You are expected to do better in terms of marketing, in terms of visibility, in terms of branding, and it was just so poor in that end, where you also begin to question how much did they really care about this Gold Cup? Did CONCACAF just host and launch this inaugural Women's Gold Cup to tick a box off the list and say, well, we've done it, we have a Women's Gold Cup. Oh, we talk about the Men's Gold Cup. Well, you know what, we also have a Women's World Cup. Oh, did you know we also have a Women's Gold Cup? It seemed to me that this is something that they just wanted to tick off the box, which really bothers me because, like I mentioned, I think there's huge potential in a competition like this. The teams, the guest teams, the occasion of it being after the World Cup and, you know, before the Olympics. There's a lot that could have been done and explored, and none of that was given. So I'm not very hopeful with CONCACAF because I know the history of how underwhelming and how just the lack of care to take this properly. I don't think they'll turn things around, but I do hope with some of the critical conversations that we're having, some of the backlash that they're receiving, that there does happen a conversation of, okay, what did we do wrong here that we can learn from moving on? To add on to that, some of the scheduling was particularly poor. For example, the US and Mexico, which was on the third match day of the group stages, the final match day of group stages, played against each other on February 26th. US's next game, which was the quarterfinal, was not until March 3rd, okay? 26th to 3rd, that's a week. That is 6 days that they had a rest. Canada, for example, played that third match day on February 28th and played their quarterfinal on March 2nd. So they had from Wednesday to Saturday. They basically had maybe Thursday as a rest day, Friday as a training, and Saturday as the game. So scheduling again is a little bit poor, where you're getting teams get a double the amount of rest as the other days. Now, Beth Priestman was asked about this, and she said, this is actually great. This is what we want. We want big, turnarounds, very quick. This is how the Olympics is going to be. So this mimics the Olympics and this mimics our preparations. But another head coach would have not viewed this very big quick turnaround as good as Beth Priestman. I mean, if you've listened to any Beth Priestman press conferences or quotes, she is unimaginably optimistic and too positive sometimes. But again, we're talking about safeguarding of players. Honestly, I'm very, very happy. This is almost a shout out to the medical team for the Canadian players, because they played on the 28th and then they played on the 2nd. On the 2nd, they went 120 minutes. And then 4 days later, they went another 120 minutes with the US on that water. So the fact that we're only dealing with possible concussions of Vanessa Gilles, I'm astonished. Kudos to that medical team, because they were working way too hard to probably getting those players fit. But it shouldn't be like that. I shouldn't be here praising a medical team for having to work with a schedule like that and timing like that, because it shouldn't be like that. Again, safeguarding was completely thrown out the window for this Gold Cup. So obviously I was very excited for it. I think we had some great games. I think Mexico really tuned in a lot of fans. I was enjoying seeing Canada play some of the most fluid football that they've played in some time. Understandably, it was against the likes of El Salvador and Paraguay and Costa Rica, but there's been a lot of improvements from what we saw at the World Cup. Very similar with the US, we are seeing finally that youth be given a chance. Jaden Shaw is a player that I think, and I've said this in many, many episodes, that should have gone gone to the World Cup, and we're finally seeing her excel. So this was, you've got the right teams, you've got the great players, but they were not given a canvas to properly showcase their soccer. They were not given a proper opportunity to really showcase how good they can be, and that's a shame, but that is something that we continue to fight for and advocate for better in the women's game. Ironically, I'm filming this on International Women's Day, so let me take this opportunity to say happy International Women's Day, delayed for any of those celebrating. Thank you for all the women, past and present, that continue to fight for and advocate for more and work very hard to break down barriers and take a lot of sacrifices, inspire with achievements. This is a great day to celebrate all the women around you today, tomorrow, and every day. But it's, again, quite ironic that this is the episode that I'm filming on International Women's Day, and it only tells me how much more we still have to go with the game, specifically in this region, in the CONCACAF region, in South America, North America. There's still a lot of work to do, and so for the final, Brazil and the US, I'm hoping for a dry pitch. I'll just be happy for that to happen. Again, as a Canadian, I'm obviously not rooting for the Americans, but if they win, right on. This one, I'm afraid I'm Brazil. And I think, with how often Canada and Brazil has faced each other, there's just that kind of sisterhood that's formed now, where I unfortunately will be rooting for the CONMEBOL nation. But, jokes aside and everything, I'm very excited to see how those teams match up. This will be the real test for the US because they obviously were not tested against Canada, and Brazil are just on a killer spree. So let me know your thoughts of the Gold Cup so far. Are you enjoying it? Are you also like, this was a completely useless thing because CONCACAF didn't take it seriously and the players were just put at risk? Any particular goals that you've enjoyed? Because I feel like we've seen some bangers in this tournament. Some players really shine. I can sit here and talk plenty about the Canadian players, but there's been a handful that have shined. You have to give some props to Adriana Leon, as well as Buchanan. I thought she'd had pretty good games. Jessie Fleming, what an absolute engine she is. I can sit here and give a lot of compliments, but they definitely need to go back and learn some penalties. And ironically, Bev Priestman said that they drilled a lot of penalties in preparation to this game. But it's hard to take away much from that game. Anyways, let me know your thoughts and opinions down below. I would love to read them. I think, this is a discussion that I want to hear the opinions of you guys. As always, to stay updated and to continue enjoying the beautiful game, make sure you subscribe to me here on YouTube. Follow me on Twitter. I'm also live on all streaming platforms, Spotify, Apple Music, Google Podcasts, wherever it is that you listen. She Scores Bangers. You will find all episodes on there. Not only do I have great episodes coming up, as I'm working on a lot of fun things, but there's also really interesting interviews that are lined up, and I'm very, very excited to share with you guys from both players and non-players. Really cool individuals that have contributed a lot to the game and continue to contribute, that I will be bringing some of these conversations onto the channel here on the podcast. You want to follow, you're going to enjoy it. And that is my final happy International Women's Day today. And I will see you later.